welcome to Co-Opinions. My name is Josh, and today I have Jake with me.
Hello.
So today we are going to talk about how to make a sales pitch for an older game that you want to recommend, and also we are going to talk about games that have semi-obscure genres that we'd like to see expanded more. But before we get into that, Jake, why don't you talk about the things you've been playing, and we'll talk about some game news that's caught our eye.
Well, so when Nintendo announced the Super Nintendo Classic, I was super excited that it was coming out, and then, of course, I couldn't find one.
Right.
So I ended up doing some work for a friend of mine, ripping out cabinets from their house before they moved, and he had managed to acquire one, and he's like, what can I pay you? And I'm like, that. So he didn't give me that one, but he did go out and actually find one for me and bought it for me. So because of that, I finally had some time to sit down and play games on it a little bit, and I've been making my way through Secret of Mana.
Now, what are your thoughts on the Secret of Mana? Because that game recently got I'm going to say a remake. Yeah, because it's entirely with 3D models, and they changed the sound. Did you play it originally back when you were a youngling?
Yes, it's actually the game that got me into RPGs back in the day.
Gasp.
Because I always thought the whole turn-based thing was really stupid. And a friend of mine, same friend who actually found the SNES Classic for me, was like, here, play this game, give it a try. It's not like your typical RPG. And I played it and I was like, this is awesome. It is not the video game of math like I thought it would be.
Math.
And so that caused me to give Final Fantasy III a try back then, which became my favorite Final Fantasy of all time. But as for the remake, man, there's no way I could justify it. They want $40 for a game that all they did was make it 3D sprites, and they're not good 3D sprites. They're like GameCube era level 3D sprites.
Now, that is a point of debate depending on who you ask, but I know that something, and I don't know where you fall on this side of the argument, and this is actually going to be a different episode I want to record about metagaming, which is to say trophies and achievements. Frequent contributor to the show, Chris, played through the remake, and he said that the trophies actually detracted from the experience for him because they imposed a set of completion rules, so to speak. So while he felt that he had been doing a thorough playthrough, he found out he missed something and he couldn't go back without playing most of the game, and it drained a lot of the fun for him.
So one of the things that gets me about the remake is the Secret of Mana was originally designed to be on the Super Famicom disk system. And when that whole thing fell through, they had this mostly completed game, Seiken Densetsu 2,
right,
that they couldn't use because they didn't have the storage. So they had to massively cut down the story of Secret of Mana to fit inside of a cartridge.
Is that why it's not good?
Well, you say it's not good.
I am not a fan of that game.
But if you play the game through, you can see where it's like, okay, I feel like there should have been more fleshing of the story here.
That's what really got me, was it felt weirdly hollow.
And that's why, is because they had to cut. I mean, there are sections where, you go to one of the mana, not the Mana Fortress, one of the Mana Temples, and you're like, oh, I'm going to go through this big fight. No, it's one room.
It's Santa. And
it's because they had to cut out massive swaths of the game. And so the remake doesn't bring any of that back. It's the original game with 3D sprites and worse music.
I have heard that some sections of the music is weirdly synthesized. I know an example I heard was the Mana Fortress. They took a lot of the spirit out of the music with the remake.
Yeah, so the original composer, he understood that here we have this console, right? And the console does synthesized instruments, but they're not violins and trombones and drums. They were heavily what we today call chiptuned.
Right.
And so he instead worked those in as their own distinct instruments. And it worked very, very well. It's why it's often such a well thought of soundtrack. And when they remade the music, they did it with an orchestra, and they just did not catch the feeling right the same way that it worked on the Super Nintendo. And so you get some really, like, if you go and listen to some of it, it's just like, it sounds like random instruments mashed together that vaguely sound like the original music, but not, some of the instruments are quieter than they should be, and some of it almost sounds like they're out of time.
Weird.
Yeah, it's I'm sure not all of the music is like that, but the couple of instances I saw, heard, I was like, that just is incongruous.
All right. Well, anything else game-wise for you?
That's about it on what I've been playing.
All right. I'm going to do mine before we jump into news stuff real fast.
Okay.
And so for me, the big things that I've done is I beat the Uncharted The Lost Legacy, the game that started as an expansion for Uncharted 4, but they later decided there was enough content it could be its own little spinoff. And though I don't want to get into it in depth here, I believe it is my favorite Uncharted game, because to go through it very briefly, there is no silly romantic subplot, which most of the Uncharted games had. There is a higher emphasis on puzzles, which I always felt the Uncharted games should have. The games are about treasure hunting, sort of, but I always felt the treasures were very difficult to find. There is an open world portion of the game, which is another thing I love. I think they should have figured out how to do this in other Uncharted games, because it was very well done in my opinion. But the open world portion, if you collect all of these MacGuffins, you get a rudimentary treasure radar. It doesn't make it so you can find all of them super easily, but it makes it much, much easier to find them, which I felt was a good trade-off for somebody like me who likes collecting treasure, but doesn't like breaking the flow of the game tremendously to do so. So there were a lot of little details I didn't realize I wanted. Also, the motion capture for the main protagonist, Chloe, who is a assisting character in the second Uncharted game, the motion capture may be the most expressive I've seen characters in this whole series. Like, it was shockingly well done. But the other big thing that I finished up was Brent and I finished streaming the Little Nightmares DLC, and we're actually going to have somebody who watched us stream, a dude named Ethan from over in the UK. He actually had a lot of insight on this game. So actually by the time this goes up, the other episode might have already aired, I'm not sure. But he's going to record an episode with us about Little Nightmares. Looking forward to that a lot. Oh, that was a dark game that went to some dark places. But finally, I have started up Suikoden 2, which you call Suikoden. How do you pronounce it?
Suikoden.
Whatever. You know what I'm talking about every time I say it. The downside is I have to use a recruitment guide, because I heard the ending is heavily dependent on if you get all the characters recruited.
Yes.
And in what I would only call a staggering gameplay misdesign, you can miss some of those people, which is terrible.
Well, there's 108 of them, so
you can still miss some. Mm-hmm. And if you need all of them to beat the game...
No, not to beat the game, to get the best ending.
Okay, that's what I meant. Still, I don't want to have to replay a 25-hour game because I missed some dude because I accidentally didn't realize I wasn't supposed to kill him all the way. The downside there is the recruitment guide is making it so I'm not quite as blind playing the game. For example, this is a 20-year-old game too, so I don't care about spoiling it. Very early in the game, the recruitment guide says, you'll be able to recruit this individual when you come to the ruins of this village. What do you mean, the ruins? I'm in the town now, and I see no ruins. Dang it.
Oh.
So,
see, I since I know exactly where you're at in the game, I thought about giving spoilers.
No.
But
Ooh.
I would rather you enjoy the game because I really, really want you to like this game.
Yeah, and you spoiling for me is a pretty guaranteed way of me going, I think I'm going to see how The Last Guardian is.
Especially since I've been trying to get you to play this damn game for, I don't know,
it's been
several years.
It's been at least half a decade, without exaggeration. Anyways, let's burn through the news that caught us real fast. So, Jake, why don't you go first?
The only thing that sticks out in my mind recently that I remember is Valve recently announcing, "Hey, we're making games again!" Which,
Gasp!
is great, except the only thing I have to say there is, guys, you're releasing a card game.
Yeah, I hear that those are really popular now.
Yeah, I know. And it's not like they don't have precedent for doing it, because they've been doing card games inside of Steam for, well, probably half a decade.
It's been a minute.
But, I don't know. I can't get into those.
You want to be excited about this, but you can't be currently.
Yeah, because it's not any of the games from Valve that I love.
No Portal 3. No Half-Life 3. Nothing doing.
No.
All right, anything else?
That's all I got at the moment.
All right, so I technically have a bunch of news that is derived solely from a small bit of news. We recently recorded a episode about the 1-year Switch retrospective. It was so thorough we didn't get a chance to talk about recent developments, including the Nintendo Direct that was released recently. I'm not going to say when, because I always get on Brent for dating the episode. Anyways, the Nintendo Direct did have a large amount of content in it, and I'm going to run through that real fast and my general thoughts on it. They had 4 3DS announcements, which frankly was 4 more than I thought we would see. Thought they were in the process of dismantling it, and the fact that 3 out of 4 of these games are ports doesn't do a lot to change my opinion. But they're giving us a WarioWare collection, which is great. We just released a mini-sode on WarioWare. Love that game. They showed they're doing a sequel to a 3DS game, Dylan's Rolling Western. That's actually getting something new. They're remaking Bowser's Inside Story for release in 2019, which is exciting because that's the best Mario and Luigi game. That's a bit of a snub for Partners in Time, the second Mario and Luigi game, because I guess that's relegated to the bowels of history. They're also remaking Luigi's Mansion for 3DS. That's a weird decision. Didn't know where that was coming from. To get into the Switch news, they said that they were going to have free post-launch DLC for Kirby. That's great. I love Kirby. That game looks awesome. They also announced Okami HD is coming to the Switch. It's good we're seeing Capcom support, but I'm not buying this game a third time. They also said some game called Sushi Strikers coming out. I have no opinion on it, but it's great to see more original-esque content. They also said Octopath Traveler, the game from Square Enix, is getting a release on July 13th. If you are interested in old-school RPGs, look this up. They announced that Travis Strikes Again, another No More Heroes game, heavily inspired by indie games, which is amazing, including but not limited to the game Fury, the all-boss fight game, is going to be releasing at some point in 2018. I love No More Heroes, so I couldn't be more on board for this. Dark Souls Remaster got a release date of May 25th and included the fact there's going to be a Sunbro amiibo. That's right, you can get Solaire of Astoria doing the Praise the Sun pose. Unfortunately, it's a GameStop exclusive, which means I might not get it for months. They also had a big insight about Mario Tennis Aces, which some people are super excited about this. I am not one of them. It does look cool. I won't be buying it. They're porting over Captain Toad from the Wii U, further cementing the fact that they're trying to cannibalize any fraction of good games they can get off of it. There's expanded content, not enough for me to re-justify buying the game. They're porting Undertale to the Switch, which I guess somebody's excited for that. Out of all the indie games I've ever played, that one doesn't need more exposure, but still loved it, so more power to them. The Crash Bandicoot trilogy is coming over in July, which is shocking with how fast that is. Also, Crash Bandicoot not on a PlayStation console. Novel. Little Nightmares Complete Edition's coming over in May. That game needs all the exposure it can get. South Park Fractured Butthole, a game that the announcer most definitely didn't want to pronounce like butthole, is coming out in late April. That's shocking because South Park on a Nintendo console is not something I would have ever guessed I would have seen. Hyrule Warriors Complete Edition got a mid-May release date, which is exciting because there's a lot of content there. If you have any interest in Warriors games and you like Zelda, you should pick up Hyrule Warriors Definitive Edition. They announced an ARMS tournament, which I mean, guess means there's still some support for it. Splatoon 2 is getting a huge content update and a single-player expansion this summer. And they also teased a new Smash game coming at some point in 2018. The belief it is new and not a port because it showed an updated Link model from Breath of the Wild, and the copyright only showed 2018, where typically if it's a port, it shows the original copyright date and the new copyright date.
Didn't it also have the Inklings?
Yeah, but that could have just been an extended port. Like when they brought Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, they included new characters, even though the game itself wasn't new. So I tried my hardest to get through that without taking a breath.
That was a lot to get through.
That was from one 30-minute direct, too. I made sure to keep all those notes down because I knew I would use them at some point, and that's when I'm using them.
Well, good job getting through it all.
Whew. All right. So on that note, I think we're ready to launch into our actual topics. What would you say?
Let's give it a throw.
Fantastic. So the first of those topics, this ties almost directly into Shurikiden too, is that sometimes there are games that we played when we were younger that we absolutely want to convince people to give a shot. But that can be difficult. So what I said we should do for this first topic is, how do you convince somebody to play a game that you enjoyed tremendously when you were younger, knowing how far games have come since then? And the approach we're going to take on this is not just to give a sales pitch for older games, but also diagnose how we break down said sales pitch for people. So, Jake, would you like to lead this, or you want me to go ahead?
Go ahead and start it off.
All right. So, people approximately in our age range, which is to say 30 to dinosaur. Sorry, I don't know how old you are, and a gentleman never asks and a lady never tells. So, approximately in our age range, you're kind of going for an easy bet if you ever want to suggest something that is pixelated. Because in my opinion, and with a lot of people, the Super Nintendo / PlayStation 1 era pixel art has aged tremendously well. NES looks dated, classic, but dated. But you look at your Super Metroids, your Final Fantasy VIs, your Link to the Past, or even up to your Suikoden and Suikoden 2, that pixel art has held up tremendously well. So if you know that you're talking to somebody who has an affinity for those kind of graphics, for example, if somebody said, oh yeah, I love Final Fantasy IV, for example, in that case you would go, have you ever given Chrono Trigger a shot? I think that based on the fact that you like those kind of graphics and you like RPGs, so you want to make sure that one thing, and I'm going to get into this a little bit, the graphics have to be something you adequately prepare somebody for. That sounds silly, but if you tell somebody to go back and play the original FF7, they're in for a bad time.
Yeah, well, so one of the things that you mentioned about with the pixel art is it's funny because you always hear the retro style referred to as 8-bit.
Which is
incorrect because 8-bit is like
Shovel Knight.
8 colors. It's you have a very limited palette and you can't add more colors without completely changing the palette of everything on the screen.
Which is, just as a real quick aside, it's fascinating to read those postmortems about how they used to design games and trick the system into showing, quote unquote, showing more colors than there were. But I digress. Go back into your 8-bit thing.
So realistically, it's 16-bit that everybody has the fondness for because that's when you had 256 colors and therefore not exactly the entire palette, but close enough that, people didn't have a reason to complain.
Right. And I kind of feel like it's a cop-out because the games I have on here that are pixel art are classic games. So it does feel like a cop-out. For example, tell somebody to play Chrono Trigger. If they are approximately our age and they haven't played Chrono Trigger, this is pretty much a guaranteed thing because that game is a classic for somebody who grew up approximately. It evokes the feelings of nostalgia that tie into SNES. It is a hallmark of RPG design from that time. And Final Fantasy VI is even stronger with the story. So those are almost cop-outs. So I'm not going to refer to those when I talk about how to break this down. What I'm going to talk about is games where you kind of go a little more out there. The one that's the next safest bet, the one that we did an entire episode on, Nick and I, Super Mario RPG. That game was a odd duck even at the time. It was a fusion of Nintendo and it was just Square at the time.
Squaresoft.
Squaresoft, and it was a turn-based Mario RPG that had non-Mario characters in it, which is to say Geno, Mallow, Smithy. A lot of the antagonists were original characters. It was a narrative-driven Mario game. There were a lot of weird X factors here, but having a familiarity with what your individual you're recommending these games to can make a huge difference. So if somebody played either of the first 2 Paper Mario games or any of the first 3 Mario and Luigi games, you can easily say, if you would like to see where these got their start, this is not a long game. And in my opinion, again, I play it almost yearly, so I'm biased. Nostalgia is a difficult thing to take out of this equation.
Yeah, well, and I don't necessarily think that it's an inaccurate thing to utilize. You just have to be aware of it while you're trying to convince people, because if you play it up with the nostalgia in mind, they're going to be let down.
Right. Which is why, for example, when it comes to Super Mario RPG, I'm not going to pretend the graphics are still mind-blowing. They have a kitschy early, not mid-90s charm to them now, but they are still very early isometric 3D. Like, you can tell they're very distinctly rendered models. Render might not even be the right word, come to think of it.
It's kind of funny that you mentioned that particular game, because I remember when it was announced, and I was just like, Squaresoft? And Mario? This blows my mind.
And I remember loving the game so tremendously, and I can still recommend there are bits of that game that are still funny to me, and I think they would be funny to people objectively. For example, there's a point near the beginning of the game when you're introduced to a character, whenever he cries, it starts raining. And near the end, there's a enjoyable payoff for that, because the character whose emotions can manipulate the weather goes to meet somebody. Mario knows it's going to make him cry. So before the character even runs off, Mario opens up an umbrella, and then it starts raining. Everybody else is like, why is it raining? And runs away, and Mario just puts it away afterwards. There's just little things like that. Legitimately engaging characters. The bosses actually had some kind of characterization to them other than just, here's the guy at the end of the stage. But I find that the games I recommend have to have some kind of driving character behind them. Which isn't to say the characters have to necessarily be memorable. The game has to be memorable. Because my other examples on here, Ape Escape. I loved Ape Escape. But that's because the premise was so unique. You run around and you catch monkeys. But there's also kind of a puzzle element to it. Because you have to find the monkeys, figure out how to get the monkeys into a place you can catch them. And I just can't think of a lot of games, at least at the time, that this was the general approach. It was also one of the earliest games to use the dual control stick control scheme, and that was very unique at the time. The novelty has long since wore off on that. Right. But like Ape Escape, it was a fun, silly game. It wasn't too deep, but you did have to catch every monkey to beat the game. But you couldn't catch every monkey on the first go. I thought it was an engaging game. Out of all the ones on this list, it'd probably be my least recommended. But the other 2 I do have on here would be a game like Pokemon Snap. That is a quick game. That is a game with no real fail condition. So it's very easy to recommend because you can't really screw it up. You just take pictures of Pokemon.
And pretty much everyone I've known who's ever played that game has thoroughly enjoyed it.
It's because it's low stakes, it's high reward, it taps into a nostalgia that most people have, seeing as how Pokemon's been around since like 94. Like, it's almost a perfect storm of how to recommend an old game, because even though it does have dated polygonal graphics, people seem to overlook that because it kind of ties into a nostalgia that even kids who are like 7 still somehow have.
Right, which honestly goes back to one of my regular statements is a game is not made by its graphics. The graphics can help the game, but they don't make it.
They don't make it. But especially in cases of the early polygonal graphics, they could definitely hinder it.
Final Fantasy VII what?
Ooh, buddy. Yeah, there's some N64, but a lot of PlayStation games where that was painful.
Well, I mean, they were early 3D graphics, so it's...
They were, but the last one I'm going to use is sometimes you really got to go out on a limb and try to recommend something that's out there just for the novelty of... Maybe it's kind of like recommending old school MTV, not necessarily because it's shocking now, but because it's fascinating to see what used to be shocking, like what caused a controversy. Is it still entertaining? Is it entertaining within the context of when it was released, or is it still, and that would be Conker's Bad Fur Day on the N64. That is an important distinction because when they remade the game for the Xbox, it was actually significantly censored. The game on the N64 made huge waves because Conker was originally a kids-friendly mascot game. He was a red squirrel who had fun woodland adventures, and then Rare's like, no, I think we're going to make him drink and booze and do drugs and violently kill things. So, at the time, it blew my mind, because I was in grade school,
Especially considering it was on a Nintendo console, which has almost regularly had a squeaky clean reputation.
Mm-hmm. So, there's just a plethora of ways that you can try to sell these games. The graphics are by far the least of them. Depending on who you're talking to, though, some of these games, specifically Super Mario RPG, Chrono Trigger, and especially FF6, the music can drive it because people might not even realize how much that like FF6 contributed to further FF games.
Yeah. Link to the Past, the song we consider the quintessential Zelda game came from Link to the Past.
Yes, it did.
Same thing with like Secret of Mana. That has been remixed by video game remixers so many times because it was so iconic. It was so quintessentially it's chiptune.
Mm-hmm. It tied into what made it that game. And then there's times where the gameplay can link up, though this is definitely more recent than any of the examples. I've recommended the game Splatterhouse on 360 to people, not because it was necessarily a good game, but because it was a fun game. I found the gameplay to be tremendously fun, even if the story was a little lackluster, it could be a little frustrating at times. It was a lot of fun as a game. So I find myself making sure to tailor my recommendations to the difficulty curve, whether or not they like the subsequent games. There's not a one-size-fits-all, but as long as you're not trying to blindly recommend an older game to somebody, like you knew that I was a fan of certain RPGs that weren't too difficult with good pixel art. As such, you said I should play Suikoden 2.
Right.
Like, all right, I'll give it a shot eventually.
And, I mean, for most people that are into JRPGs, it should not be a terribly difficult sell, just because the pixel art's really good, and because it was on the PlayStation, it had 3D capabilities, but instead of doing the whole, we're going to have 3D models on it, they instead just used that for only things like the spells. So the spells look way cool in this 3D graphical way, while the rest of the game is all sprite-based.
And it makes for a very pleasant contrast, but...
And it ages better.
It ages much better.
Yeah, so Suikoden 2 is just one of those quintessential games that is really an easy sell for anybody who likes that genre already. Since it's got a great story, and it's really easy to create a synopsis on, something that could bring them in, because that's one of the ways that I like to try and bring people in, is give them just a small taste of what the story is, just enough to get them hooked, so that it'll pique their interest and they'll want to look into it. The only other thing that I can think to do, besides all of the things that you've already mentioned, which was already on my list, is realistically what had to happen to get you to play Suikoden 2, which is someone buy it for you.
And it helped tremendously that it was $2.50 when I got it. That's another benefit of recommending these old games. I know a lot of people cried foul when a lot of games started becoming digitally distributed. Do you know how expensive Final Fantasy VI was when it was on PS1? I bought a copy of Anthology for like $80 before it was Greatest Hits.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have an original cartridge of the Final Fantasy III version of it, and that was a $50 game when it was new, and when you bought it used, even in like 2004, you were still probably paying $30 for it.
Oh, you were paying more like $60 to $90, depending where you
If
bought
it was before the Anthology, yes.
Yeah, that was ridiculous. So
because it was hard to find because everybody kept it.
But anyways, I believe this ties, you were able to segue this into your topic, which was games that have semi-obscure genres you'd like to see expanded more, yes?
Yes.
All right, so take her away.
So, I guess I'll just start with some of the just oddballs that really don't have a specific genre in and of themselves. Games like Papers, Please.
Now, Papers, Please, I'm not going to say was an indie darling because I think it got a lot of recognition, but it was difficult to classify because it was kind of a stress simulator.
Yeah, kind of.
And it was a game where it had a shockingly large emotional impact for a game that was essentially about double-checking paperwork.
Right. In a pseudo-communist socialist country.
As a quick aside, have you seen the short film Papers, Please? They recently released it.
I know of it, but I haven't watched it.
I will show it to you once we're done recording, and on top of that, I'll put a link of it on. It nails the tone perfectly.
I believe that.
So, anyways, yeah, I can't think of a single other game that reminded me of Papers, Please.
Yeah, no, it was a pretty weird one. Another game that was just weird and off the wall, and they made a series out of it, of all things, was Katamari Damacy.
That was a game where the novelty was definitely there in the first one, and while they did expand onto the idea of rolling things into balls in subsequent games, it very quickly became we're beating a horse to death.
Yeah, by the end of the so-called series, they really kind of were, but on the other hand, they were fun.
They were fun games, but they started so lacking in innovation that they were just redoing old stuff over and over.
And I think that's kind of what also happened to the rhythm games, but most specifically Guitar Hero and
Rock Band.
Rock Band, thank you.
But anyways, yeah, that was definitely the music, the unabashedly Japanese stylings, and the unique gameplay definitely all contributed to making this difficult to quantify or classify.
Yeah.
But
another game that is rather difficult to explain would be Descent.
Now, you're gonna, as far as I know, this is a game about going down, which the only games I know about that are H games we're not really going to talk about on here, so you'll have to give me...
So Descent is sort of like a space combat sim, but crossed with a first-person shooter style. So it's you're a pilot who has to, I forget what it was you have to do. It was released around the same time as Doom.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, Descent. You end up going into a mine and fighting all of these kind of like automated drone ships. And because it's first-person shooter, it's not you're constantly flying. It's you're forwards, backwards, and then, the XYZ axis. But you can actually like stop, and it's not like your regular flight sim. So it's always been kind of unique. And what's funny is a lot of people know its follow-ups, which were the Free Space games. And they're not, other than the fact that they share like the same developer and the same universe, they're not at all the same game. So it was all. In fact, there's supposedly someone's making a remake of Descent, which will be interesting to see how that turns out.
Fascinating. But beyond that, I know there were a few more, and we're gonna touch on these oddballs very briefly, just because it's difficult to classify any of these. One of them that you had mentioned that I think deserves a special mention. You had mentioned No More Heroes. I vetoed that though, because I personally could talk about Suda51 games for easily half an hour to an hour. I feel like their genre is Suda51 because he's a weirdo.
He really is.
He's great, but he's a weirdo. I have played all of his games except the Silver Case, which I believe was his first ones, and Killer 7. Haven't played that. But I've played both No More Heroes. I've played Shadows of the Damned, Lollipop Chainsaw. I did not play his free-to-play game just because I am morally opposed to that. But I've played a fair chunk of what he has made, and I'm a huge fan. But some other games you had mentioned. One, you haven't played it, but you looked it up. Tokyo Jungle.
Mm-hmm.
That game is so weird. Because to unlock further narrative chapters, you have to get further and further in free play mode. But to get further in free play mode, you have to go further into the Tokyo Jungle, as it were. And things get weird. Like when you get to the deepest level that unlocks the final narrative chapter, you're finding velociraptors and robots. Like at one point near the end of the game, they're like, there was a terrible catastrophe. I guess this is spoilers, but I think I might be the only person who beat this game. Like, there was a terrible catastrophe. We have to time shift the people from the past into the present. And you respond, won't that cause a weird time loop? No, we are simply transporting them, not time traveling. Okay. All right.
And what's funny is for a name like Tokyo Jungle, if I remember correctly, it's not a Japanese-developed game.
I don't honestly remember. I remember I got it for $1.
Huh?
And I remember the premise was so unbelievably ballistic. You play as animals or not animals trying to survive in Tokyo by you have to find other animals to eat, find other animals of your same species that you can breed with, and see how long you can survive just having offspring. It's so weird. It's so weird.
The last one I probably have on my list for this is Who's Your Daddy?
You're on your own on this one. I refuse to get into this just because of...
I love the concept of it because it's a...
Is this the one where you keep your baby from dying?
Yeah, so
I was thinking
you either play as the dad or you play as the baby, and the goal of the dad is to set up a place for the kid to play so that he's safe, and the goal of the baby is to kill yourself as quickly as possible.
Now, I was confusing that with the Are You My Dad? The game about showering with your dad.
I've never heard of this, and the fact that you have makes me kind of question things about you.
You keep talking about your thing, and I want to make sure that I did that right. Sharing with your dad simulator.
So I just always thought that was a really cool concept of one person's trying to keep you from dying, and the other person is trying to die.
Okay, it is called Shower with Your Dad Simulator 2015.
That's not, no.
It cost $1.
No, that's too much.
It's good, clean fun. Is what it says right here on the Steam page.
You had to look it up. Way to go.
I did. It has pixelated dong, and your dad has quite the mustache. This is what we've wrought in our hubris.
Our hubris? You're the one with the laptop looking up Shower with Dad or whatever the...
Now this is actually an 8-bit game. Since I'd say this is more Atari-ish.
Oh, God. What?
Maybe.
So when you said pixelated dong, it's not like censored, it's just...
Oh, no. That's a pixel dong.
I'm gonna have nightmares from that, thank you.
Fantastic. Anyways, let's go ahead and talk about... So now that we've gotten past the oddballs, why don't we talk about the games that fall into a general umbrella and why we would like to see more of those? Because all these oddball games that we have called out, like Papers, Please, I would love to find other games that manage the same stress-involving emotion levels. I would love to find, for example, in Katamari Damacy, something else that was as unhinged, innocent fun as that was.
That's a good way to describe that game.
Yeah, right? Tokyo Jungle, I kind of want that to be a single instance. I don't want anybody else to try to copy that.
So the game that really made me think of this topic was...
Shower with Your Dad Simulator.
No, it was definitely not that thing, because I didn't know it existed until you brought it up for some weird reason.
All right, continue.
It was actually a game called Dungeon Keeper, which was done by Bullfrog Entertainment.
Yes.
Who... they got bought by EA, and EA basically just kind of... First, they melded them into Westwood, and then they just kind of squished all of it.
Yeah, they actually tried to quote unquote remake this game in 2018.
No. You do not bring that terrible abortion up into this conversation.
Hey, we do not talk about things as controversial as EA here.
You're talking about showering with people's dads.
No, it's your dad.
No, it's Jake. Not my dad.
It is your dad.
No, my dad has a much more awesome mustache than that.
Okay. This guy looks like Bob from Bob's Burgers.
It really does. But the horrible 2014 just horrific attempt at cashing in on a beloved game aside, there was actually quite a bit of hours I put into both Dungeon Keeper and Dungeon Keeper 2.
So why don't you tell us what the premise behind this was before you get too nostalgic?
So the premise behind it was that you were the Dungeon Keeper, basically.
Yep.
And you were started in a underground lair where it started off with basically what they called the heart of the dungeon, which was kind of like your physical being, and you could control imps. And those imps could dig out sections around your heart and create a dungeon. And you could, you could dig out a room and then add a specific type of room to, tiles to that room. So you could have a, what they called a hatchery, which would grow chickens.
And you could have a library.
And you could have, and a torture chamber.
Succubuses.
And, so there was, what it was you were trying to take over the overworld, and you would have to grow to a certain point where you would get, you'd have to grow your dungeon on that stage to a certain point, so that the overworld people would take notice of you, come down and send their champion. You would kill their champion, and then you would take over the overworld portion and move on to the next area.
Now, in the first Dungeon Keeper, this is more semantics than to expand on it. Was there more than one hero, or was there always just the one golden armored hero in the first Dungeon Keeper?
It's been a really long time since I played it, because this is like a Windows 95 game, so it's...
We won't dig too deep into it. What about this genre, this game, really jumped out at you as being a super unique approach?
It had a lot of kind of design decisions that were similar to things like Age of Empires or Command and Conquer, but it wasn't the same. And it was there's never been anything else. Well, there has been other things. The closest game that probably came after it that wasn't a direct sequel was a game called Evil Genius, which was you were basically an evil genius from like a Bond villain, and you got to build your secret lair inside of a mountain, and they would send spies and other people towards your base, and you basically had to defend against them. So similar concept, and the fact that you were digging out sections of a mountain or underground of some form, and then designating specific rooms and doing research and gaining different types of minions.
Now, this sounds very similar to like the city building games of SimCity. What would you say differentiates this from those? And why is there anything beyond the uniqueness of creating this kind of an enclosed space with specialized areas that calls out to you about, for lack of a better term, from what we found, these are called God games?
Yeah. The biggest differentiation I can think of is probably the scale, because you're in, say, Dungeon Keeper, your dungeon is maybe a mile in size, whereas SimCity is obviously, 20, 30, 40, 60 miles big, depending on however big your city is.
Right.
And they have different goals, which obviously different types of games, so that's not terribly unsurprising. But there's that whole 3D isometric thing that happens with the Dungeon Keeper style that isn't quite the same. It's that, what do they call that? It's the...
I thought it was just isometric.
Is it just isometric?
I've always called it, like with Diablo, I've just called that isometric. Yeah,
and it's that same, third person... like what was it? 3/4 top down.
Yeah,
I think.
I always just called it top down isometric. That's always communicate. If you're like, what's top down isometric? Diablo 2. Oh,
I think it's just how the mechanics all worked is what differentiates it the most.
That makes sense. So, what are some God games? Obviously, being one of them. What are some other genres that are unique enough that you feel should be expanded more? I know one you brought up. I just want to mention this because this game is so near and dear to my heart. The interactive story games. Now, this to me hits the sweet spot. I love action games and I can like walking simulators, but to create a successful walking simulator, your story has to be on point. That's an important differentiation because if it does not hit that sweet spot, like Everybody's Gone to Rapture, which did not do well enough that the Chinese room is shuttered indefinitely. Yeah, it sucks for them. But you have games like Asura's Wrath and What Remains of Edith Finch. Both of these are great examples in entirely different ways because I think if we ever do an episode on guilty pleasure games, even a mini-sode, Asura's Wrath is probably mine.
Yeah, and you've brought that particular game up before.
Oh, I love that game.
In fact, you've brought it up on episodes I've been on.
Really?
Yeah. You brought it up on the...
Gone But Not Forgotten?
Yeah. I think that's what it was.
Okay.
But one of the things that always kind of bothered me is the term walking simulators. Mm-hmm. And that mostly came because of the... what was that?
It's the one with the cabin. Why can I not remember?
No, not the one with the cabin. It's the one where he's on the island.
Yeah, Dear Esther.
Dear Esther.
See, I remember the cabin from that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, that is literally you're just walking
for about 45 minutes
and listening to someone talk.
Yep.
And most of these games are not that. Yes, you do a lot of walking, but there's interactions with the environment that just weren't there in Dear Esther.
Yeah, Dear Esther essentially had no...
It was literally just a walking simulator, because that's all you did was walk and then listen.
And
things like Gone Home...
That's a walking simulator.
Yeah,
there are mild puzzles, but you don't really have to interact with anything to beat that game. The most you have to do is figure out what happened with your sister.
Right, but a lot of that...
I mean, there's mild... You do have to interact with the environment to get the narrative.
I mean, the very fact that you have to interact pretty much at all completely differentiates it from Dear Esther.
It does, but no game has been quite as hands-off as Dear Esther has been. True. That is the pinnacle of walking simulator, because even their follow-up game, Everybody's Gone to Rapture, even that you had to interact with stuff to continue.
Which is why I prefer the interactive story games moniker rather than walking simulators, because then you're interacting with a game that is just a story. There's no conflict in the same sense of an adventure game. Right.
And that's why I was super happy with the examples you pointed out here, like Asura's Wrath and
What Remains with Edith Finch.
Because What Remains with Edith Finch, while it is 70-ish% just walking around a house, there are these vignettes where there's very distinctly different gameplay styles. None of them are deep. None of them are deep at all. Mm-hmm. But they have very different gameplay approaches for all of these different what actually happened to these members of your family.
Right, like the time you turn into a cat.
The time you turn into a cat, the time that you end up flying through the air, the time that you manipulate the wind, the time where you travel 30 years-ish through time.
become a comic book.
You go through a comic book. It's incredibly unique story presentation. And I'm going to go back to this for the millionth time. Asura's Wrath let you play as an entire anime series. It was amazing. Every chapter was like a season. Every not chapter, act was like a season. Every chapter was an episode. There were intro credits. There were outro credits. You had power levels. You fought the planet. It was amazing. I loved it. You punched God to death.
Another game like that I really enjoyed was Firewatch.
That's one of those. I thought that game was actually gameplay. Is it not?
It's more story related. It walks kind of a fine line between the two, which is one of the points of this is there's not much conflict. You don't fight anybody. It's almost more of a line between interactive, walking simulator and a point and click, almost. But you don't really fight anybody. There's no real action.
I had no idea you didn't fight people in that game. Fascinating. I'm not going to pick it up, but that's fascinating nonetheless.
I would actually recommend it. It's pretty good. I greatly enjoyed that game. Far more than I thought I would.
Well, and it's interesting because I would like us to give a few examples of genres, and we'll even touch on one I said we were going to cut out just because I feel like we're focusing very heavily on the narrative-focused games with a weird twist. But games like, have you played Kentucky Route Zero?
I have not, but it is on my list of games to get.
It is one of the most surreal games that I have ever played. But it is essentially... No, it's an adventure game. It's an adventure game with no fail states. It's a narrative-driven adventure game.
Okay.
And it is set... It's almost like it's set in a modern fantasy. It's so weird, and it's so melancholy. I'm not going to say it's difficult to recommend, but it's a weird game to play. In a good way. It's not one of those games where after you're done playing it, you're going to go lie down in the road because there's nothing left for you. But it's also not one of those games where you come out of it feeling energized. Like, it's one of those games where you finish it up and you kind of sit back and you think for a minute. And they only have 4 out of 5 chapters out. Mind you, this game has been...
Oh, they still haven't completed that?
I think it's going to complete... They announced, and this was not a recent announcement... Kentucky Route Zero TV edition is coming to the Switch. Whenever it comes out on the Switch, I think the final episode will come out on PC. To be frank, it wouldn't surprise me at all if I just ended up rebuying it for the Switch. Because I should probably beat it on Steam. Anyways, it's a very melancholy game, but all these games are incredibly narrative focused. So I want to talk about games that aren't just narrative focused. There are also games that have a decent amount of action to them. Now, don't get me wrong, some of them, like Papers, Please, while it does have a narrative to it, it's mostly stress. Games like Katamari Damacy has almost no plot and is just wacky, zany, roll things up into your soul ball. I would like to talk about games that have kind of time-loopy time travel involved, and we're only going to touch on this superficially because it is the focus of a different similarly placed episode. So games like Majora's Mask, where you have to keep redoing the same 3 days in order to solve everybody's problems. When that was originally coming out in like 2001-ish, I think it was, right. Somewhere around there. This was an unbelievably unique concept to the point of being, 99. It had to be 99 because Ocarina of Time came out in 98 and Majora's Mask came out like a year after it. That's, okay. I think
that sounds more right, because...
Okay. Anyways, the idea of replaying the same 3 days over and over was unique to the point where it felt mildly alienating for people at first. Because it wasn't Ocarina. Ocarina was so popular that every 3D game up until Breath of the Wild was just Ocarina but.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they had the same problem with the Final Fantasy games where it was...
After 7,
everybody's like, oh, I like 7, so I want more 7. To the point where they're remaking 7 now.
Did you hear, and here's a very quick aside, and praying it doesn't date the episode on this one, they actually posted a listing for more developers to bring the quality up to standard.
No.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that during the news part, but that's a bad sign.
Ooh.
Anyways, so Majora's Mask, and we've seen a few games, I'm not even going to say more recently because there's like 7 years in between each of these, but Ghost Trick came out in 2009-ish, a game...
Fantastic game.
A amazing game that I will touch on a little bit more in the relevant episode, but it also had to do with going back in time to try and change a bad thing that happened, and if I had played this in 2009-ish or whenever it came out, it would have blown my mind with how unique this premise was, because it was incredibly well animated. It was kind of like a weird puzzle game with an interesting setup. The idea was you go back and try to prevent people from dying by sort of possessing their corpse.
Yeah, and done by the same group that originally did Ace Attorney.
It is. It's by level 5, I believe. And there's so much good about that game. But then, about 8 years after that, the game The Sexy Brutale came out, which involved doing a time loop over and over to try and save all the people in a masquerade ball from being murdered by the staff. Now, the way that you prevented the atrocities in each of these games was markedly different, but you can see a same general undercurrent, which makes me kind of want more of these games, but they're all done so differently that it's impossible for me to make a good recommendation.
Right.
Because the approach is always so unique on each of these. Like, you change such tiny minutia in both Ghost Trick and The Sexy Brutale, whereas in Majora's Mask, you are literally stopping the moon from falling. Like, it is the exact opposite of minutia.
And I'm honestly surprised that they didn't try and do a sequel to Ghost Trick with how good that game was.
The game, from my understanding, didn't sell super well, which bums me out to no end, though I myself am guilty of this, as I did not buy it for almost a decade after it came out.
And in fact, you only bought it because you heard that it was similar to Sexy Brutale.
Which, yes and no, but that is more touched upon in a different episode. So, we're getting real close to the tail end of this episode. Are there any other games you wanted to talk about that had kind of unique premises that you'd like to see expanded more? We found a couple umbrellas. We found time travel-ish games. We found games that have a strong narrative focus. We've had the weird oddball games that we found very difficult to classify.
Another oddball game would probably be Lemmings.
Yes! So, I will be 100% honest here. I know the premise. I've seen screens. I've never played it.
So it's really kind of cool because, I mean, you know the story behind Lemmings. They'll just follow whatever off the edge of the cliff.
Yep.
And whereas that's actually a false thing that doesn't really happen in nature, the game itself uses that concept where you have, let's say you have 50 lemmings in your level, and you have to get them from point A up to point Q.
Okay.
And so you can designate any lemming in the group to do one job.
Mm-hmm.
So you can say, build stairs, or dig a hole, or lay down, explode.
Or block.
Or block. Different things, and you have to get so many of these lemmings through the level.
Mm-hmm.
And all they do is, if you don't give them a task, they just walk forward. Until they
right off the edge.
Until they go off a cliff, or they find something that turns them around,
or they die.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
isn't there other things that can kill them too?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's a bunch of other stuff in there that can kill them, like spikes and fire, lava. They can drown in water. They can't swim. Different things like that. And so it was always it was kind of like a time management building sim that was, you had very weird limitations. It was a rather unique game, and though they've tried to do it again, they've never succeeded, as obvious by the fact that no one pretty much remembers any of the games that...
Yeah,
were similar.
I remember there was Lemmings. I thought there might have been other Lemmings-ish games or more Lemmings games, but honestly, it was never there for me. Not that I dislike them, just it seemed like such a weird concept. I think one thing that fundamentally broke it for me was it was impossible to save all of them. Like, that bothered me.
Yeah, sometimes you just had to...
You had to give up one or two.
Some of them.
Yeah.
What was another one? Oh, Worms. I don't know if you remember Worms. That was a...
That was an incredibly unique, at the time, approach to like a almost arena fighter, sort of, just because the weird map mixed with the physics-based gameplay. Yeah. There was a lot of factors, and unfortunately, they never, in my opinion, and this is a very biased opinion, I never felt like the games got better after Armageddon. Like, to me, the height of Worms games was
most of them are pretty
Armageddon.
much just Armageddon again.
Right.
I can't disagree with that. The one other genre that I would really personally love to see, outside of probably, the point-and-click adventure games, which at one time used to be huge, and now are relegated to, like, one developer.
Well, and that has to do with we
found different and better ways to make those same games.
We did, but like I did any of that. No, it was more, it just kind of felt like it was a generational thing. For example, I would say that the unofficial death of the adventure game, and mind you, I haven't done research into this, it's just what I've heard based off sales numbers versus reception. Grim Fandango was pretty much the death of the adventure game for a long, long time. Now, it's a huge bummer because I played the HD re-release, remake, whatever. That game is superb, which is to say the writing is superb. The puzzles are incredibly dated, which I kind of feel like contributes to why the genre had such a massive fall off, because the adventure games used to rely on a lot of really weird puzzles.
Yeah. You never played the Neverhood, did you?
No.
So that is, from a historic standpoint, that is a really interesting game to play. It was
the N64 that didn't get released on the N64?
No. It was a stop motion clay based game. In fact, their Armakrog is a spiritual successor to that. Unfortunately, it was nowhere near as good. Neverhood became so popular upon its release that Microsoft picked it up and published it, and they sold out so quickly that the original developers did not have a copy of the game.
Wow.
Really interesting, really fun game, but really not exactly what we were going for here. The one semi-genre that I wanted to speak on at the end was spy and stealth games.
Like?
The Thief series.
Yeah, but you're talking about a very specific niche of stealth games, which I only mentioned because Brent and I talked about stealth games rather at length somewhat recently.
Yeah, which is one of the reasons why I brought it up, but I mean, if you look at all of them out there, the ones that have done it properly are really rare. I mean, you have Thief, you have the Sniper series, and you have Dishonored. And most of the other ones are like, yeah, you can do stealth, but really it's just easier to mow through everything.
And I feel like part of that has to do with the limitations of the technology allowing for a good execution of it. Which isn't to say that it's been impossible, because the original Thief game came out quite
I was about to say, ago. I don't think it was a limitation of the situation so much as it was...
It also has to do with being fun. Like, if you don't... I feel like those kind of stealth games without the proper technical enablements... whatever. Yeah, I'm making it a word. Without the proper technical abilities is just frustrating.
I don't know, because... Thief did gangbusters, like enough that they didn't expect that they were going to be making a sequel, let alone as quickly as they did. And, I mean, on the other hand, the Sniper series has been around for 4 games now.
Now, see, I'll admit that my knowledge of Thief is very limited, because didn't the originals only come out on PC? Am I wrong there?
That's probably correct. I think they might have ported them eventually, but those games are kind of weird because they were done by Looking Glass Studios. I think it was Looking Glass Studios. It was either them or one of the other studios that was involved in the terrible debacle that was Daikatana.
Ooh.
So that was the game that bankrupted like 3 different studios. So basically what ended up happening is they made Thief, they made Thief 2, then they worked on Daikatana and went under.
It looks like Thief and Thief 2 only came out on PC. Thief Deadly Shadows came out on PC and Xbox.
Okay.
And then the 4th Thief came out on Xbox One, PS4. Like, you can see the reviews go...
Yeah, well, that's because the guys who originally developed it weren't the ones working on the later ones.
Yeah, makes sense. And plus, at that time, it was also competing in a much more saturated market. But we have definitely gone... I don't mean to cut you off.
No,
here.
that's fine. I was done with my conversation on that
Anyways, so these have been great examples of games that kind of had obscure ideas we'd like to see expanded. And I personally think we touched on ways we would like to see them expanded and why, personally.
Mm-hmm.
So, thank you very much, Jake, for coming on.
Anytime.
Is there a different way that you would suggest your friends look into classic games that you're a fan of? Is there a suggestion we made that you would personally disagree with? What kind of obscure genre didn't we touch on? Which obscure genre isn't actually obscure and we're just dense? Weigh in online and let us know. But until next time, my name is Josh and this is Co-Opinions.